It's been a while since we last visited the Vita Carnis series on the channel Darien Koloi. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend watching it because we're going to be diving into season 2 and it would be useful to have some information in the back of your mind. With that being said, I will be giving a refresher to those who need it if you have watched part 1. So this world setting is in a world similar to ours, however there's one gruesome, frightening aspect. Creatures or plants of all shapes and sizes, dangerous or friendly, called Vita Carnis, which are spread all around the world. They all have a very fleshy appearance, and in human society, people have to figure out ways to survive these creatures or to live amongst them. Some of these creatures can even be kept as pets and can be consumed, eaten. But again, many are dangerous and can kill humans by either hunting them down, trapping them, or infecting them. And there's also one mysterious creature in this family, the Singularity, a dark floating ball with a lot of classified information, but my initial suspicions when first covering this series is that a group of people found the Singularity one day and are helping it prosper, like a secret organization or a cult is behind all of this and are using the Singularity for whatever personal goal. Oh, and there's also a very suspicious spice being added to food that could be infecting people, and there's an organization called Carcass, which is probably looking into all of this crazy shenanigans in the world. This is all that we covered in my first video, and if you're interested to learn about what happened next in the series, then sit back, relax, maybe get a snack, and as always, my name is Ripa Estrella. Let's explore. Vita Carnis, Facility 0. Actually, before we jump into the second season, let's first talk about this video since I didn't cover it previously. This video opens with a logo for the Carcass organization before transitioning to a map and an audio talking about infiltrating a facility. We also get shown a document with interesting information, but it was still pretty vague. There's been sightings of singularities in multiple continents, and the goal is to apprehend and contain them. We then get a zoom in on the text for Facility 0 before showing us the map once again, and we see the 3 teams for the mission getting ready to infiltrate. A harvester was taken out during this, and a monolith was spotted nearby, so the team had to be extremely sneaky, but luckily they soon entered the building. Also, besides body cameras, we see security footage in the facility so we know what's happening inside, and the infiltration team managed to go deep into the building. However, there was some interference, which made the cameras very staticky, and once they burst through some doors, chaos was let loose. There were screams, gunfire, and we briefly see through the static what I think is a ritual and a group of cultists praying. It was kind of hard to see, but anyways, this was the end of the first season, so with that now out of the way, let's move on to season 2. Vita Carnis, New Beginnings. Firstly, we open with a warning, so acknowledge everything here. Then we see a snowy land with a monolith standing ominously behind a fence, and the sounds of the news. We learn that a large group of cultists, likely from the previous video, were apprehended, and surprisingly, many of them were powerful people in the world. They've murdered, kidnapped, tortured, performed ritual sacrifices, are frauds, and also developed chemical weapons? So, obviously terrible people. A noteworthy person is Simon Vanguard. Obviously, they all were found guilty for their crimes, and the company behind the special spice to make food taste better were also discovered to be connected with the cult. As a result of this, Nutrier Co. is shutting down, and there's an outrage for cultivation farms to be shut down too. The public are rightfully outraged, and there's been an increase of riots and protest because of all the damages that's been done because of the cultists and the creatures. The anger is also pointed towards the government since their lack of effort to stop all of this, and people are starting to believe the government is against them. Now, switching away from the news, we get a glimpse into the facility room where a singularity is contained, but we don't get shown much of that right now because we're moving on to footage of bugs, then a program called Magister's Wonders. But that doesn't really last long either because the Carcass organization has some footage to show. We get introduced to the head director and doctor of Carcass called Dr. Marshall Trados, and it's a progress report. He talks about the 7 singularities that's in their care, and we learn that they're made of an unknown material but are compared to glass. No samples were taken to avoid damaging it. There's red shimmers of light inside it, including pulses of energy. It obviously hovers and can be moved easily, and it's hard to determine if it's organic. As for experiments that were performed, it commonly interferes with technology, but the most noteworthy experiment were the ones with cows. Having a living cow with one of the singularities doesn't show much results besides the cow being stressed. However, if a dead cow was sent inside instead, the corpse starts to melt and send out tendrils across the room. It turns into a crawl, and if you need a reminder, the crawl is a plant species of the Vita Carnis family, which is practically spread all over the world, and it's the same species that can give birth to other Vita Carnis creatures, and they can be consumed by humans just like any other plant. It also follows the circle of life rules. This was a big discovery to the organization because it makes them question the information that they learned prior about the Vita Carnis species. The Singularity technically should be the spawn point for the species, then the crawl, and after that is everything else, I assume. We then return back to the Magister's Wonders program, but that was interrupted with another carcass footage, this time with Dr. Rhodes' series. She's the head cultivator and crawl specialist. The date is July 31st, 1991, and we get shown experiments being done with the crawl. The crawl that the Singularity created acts very similar to regular crawl around the world, and as we learned before, they seem to really like radios for some reason, and during these experiments, the crawl made 7 trimmings, 2 meat snakes, and 1 mimic, which was obviously contained. Switching away from that, we see a few clips until we get introduced to another doctor named Dr. Von Panitro, a trimming specialist. The date is August 31st, 1991, and the collection of trimmings from the previous experiment were placed within an existing colony of other trimmings for social experiments. They're so cute, I forgot how much I wanted one. Anyways, the babies were accepted into the colony, and we learn that when a trimming is happy, they make a chattering noise, and when they're mad, it's obvious because they lash out. But nothing aggressive since they're relatively harmless, and it's mainly screaming. Speaking of which, we see experiments that show off their responses to negative and positive situations. And honestly, it broke my heart each time they were sprayed with cold water, because look how scared they are! To explain what the experiments are, when they play a good noise, it gives the trimmings treats, and if they play a bad noise, they spray the trimmings with cold water. The reason why they did this is because once they reunite the trimmings, they want to see how socializing makes them react to those noises. When a good noise is played in the enclosure, the trimmings are interested, and if a bad noise is played, they close themselves in as if they're frightened turtles. This was an interesting experiment because randomly they decided to play those noises to a group of wild trimmings in the wilderness, and they reacted the same way to domestic trimmings in the facility. This makes me believe that trimmings are very similar to a hive mind, and they also have this strange link or connection that makes them know what's good and bad. Truly fascinating, if you ask me. After this, we see the conclusion of the Magister's Wonders program, which was talking about the circle of life, and then the credits roll. And before we move on to the next video, obviously I want to point out the most interesting details about this video. I already had a sneaking suspicion that the Singularity is something more important than something that just spawns out of a crawl like everything else. It's way too mysterious and way too frightening for that, and I'm glad we got confirmation. When exposed to a corpse, the Singularity infects that corpse, somehow, and makes the corpse turn into the crawl, and the crawl spreads from there. To make a strange comparison, the Singularity is a grandma, the crawl is a mother and the Singularity's child, and the rest of the creatures are the child of the mother crawl? I hope that makes sense, because it does to me. Now, all of this is interesting because if we circle back to the cult that was mentioned in the beginning and how they done ritual sacrifices, this means the cult was giving dead bodies, definitely people they killed, to the Singularity to make more crawl, so the crawl in turn can make more Vita Carnis species. No wonder why there's so much spread around the world. People are feeding this thing corpses. And the fact that so many politicians and powerful people were responsible behind this is concerning to say the least. Anyways, another interesting detail that we learned was the hive mind mentality that the trimmings have, which I mentioned before. And I find it very interesting because does that mean the other creatures have a very similar link to this? Or are they all linked together? If that's the case, a spread of information within the species can happen very quickly. This is also fascinating. I really love this series. Okay, there's also an unlisted video in the description of this video. It's short and seems like nothing, but we do briefly see flashing on the screen a text which reads, September 22, 1994. I think it's time I take you up on that deal. Things are changing and not for the better. I'll do what you ask. I'll start sending them over when I get the chance. B. The title is also an interesting one because it's a cipher that needs to be translated and it says past regrets reaching out. Interesting. With that being said, let's now keep going. Vita Carnis revealed progress. It opens with multiple clips as if someone is surfing through multiple TV channels, one of which is Magister's Wonders, but just like in the previous video, we get interrupted with information by Carcass. This time it's Dr. Asram Griffiths, who is a meat snake specialist, and the Recreation Project Manager. The date is March 31st, 1992, and we're going to be shown an experiment done with meat snakes, obviously. The specimen being used was restrained and fed food daily, which, if you need a reminder, they feed off of corpses. And on the 4th day, the meat snake started mellowing out because despite being restrained, it was satisfied with being fed. That is until a few days later when the meat snake started to become sluggish with its movements, and it's now eating less. Since it's constantly being fed throughout the day, they assume that they're overwhelming the meat snake, so they had to decrease the speed in which they're feeding the snake, but sadly on the 19th day, it shut down entirely. It luckily still accepts food, however, it needs assistance. Now, what's the reason why they're doing this? Because if you remember from the first season, there was a meat snake who constantly kept eating until their flesh red color turned dark. That's what they're trying to do here, and it seems to be working since they're noticing that the meat snake is becoming darker. Samples were soon taken from the snake and put under a variety of conditions to see its resistance, and it managed to withstand a lot. This is all pretty interesting stuff until suddenly the meat snake escaped its restraints by splitting itself in half, and if you need a reminder, this is how meat snakes kind of give birth or reproduce. It multiplies by splitting themselves. Pretty fun stuff. Anyways, the 2 meat snakes were randomly wandering the facility, and because of this, the project was put on pause, but there will still be more testing in the future. We then switch away from that to channel surfing, and honestly, my favorite program is the trimming show-off because look at them all! They're all so unique and cute! And look at Patty. They're the winner of this season because they're so cool. Anyways, back to Carcass, we're with Dr. Ferrerin Brones, who's the mimic expert, and the date is September 20, 1992. Obviously, this means we're learning about mimics, and it's most definitely going to be something dangerous. First, the doctor begins with a discussion about juvenile mimics who are feisty and full of hunting instinct. They like to catch their prey with an element of surprise, and usually they go after things smaller than them until they get older. We get shown these juvenile mimics, and they sure are creepy things. We also get shown how they evolve from smaller to bigger mimics. They develop this strange cocoon around them, and they either get extracted out, or they burst out on their own, I'm assuming? Anyways, mimics that are held in captivity don't last long since they tend to hide away and reject any food offered to them, and since the adult mimics only feed off of human flesh, they end up starving. So if they want to gather more information, they have to catch one from the wild, which they do, and they even manage to get some humanoid-looking mimics. Nice. So what did they learn from these adult mimics? The way they hunt is different from when they were younger. They take their sweet time and observe their prey closely. They are also much more cautious, waiting for an opening to attack, and as we already know, they enjoy climbing into furniture for their sneak attacks. Speaking of which, this trick of theirs was discovered in the late 70s, and we also learned mimics were once called butchers. But anyways, their hunting tactics are relatively inconsistent, confusing, and random. Not only that, but since humans can't be used in the testing, it makes it more challenging to gather additional information. Now, switching away from that, we see the Magister's Wonder TV program again, then move on to footage of an incident involving a cleanup team in a test chamber. The date is November 27th, 1992, and we see the Singularity surrounded by the crawl, and we hear the sounds of screaming. Someone's leg was caught on something, and it's bleeding badly. Medical assistants soon arrived to pull the person out of their predicament, but it sounded very painful since they started to scream out more, and this caused the Singularity to freak out. And it almost sounds like the Singularity is mimicking the sounds of the man's screams, but I could be wrong, and this is where the video ends. But we're not down here yet, because once we turn to the description, there's an interesting link that takes us to an unlisted video. The date is January 5th, 1991, and it's an interrogation with Simon Vanguard, who's one of the people involved with the cult. The purpose for this interrogation is to get information out of him, but he remains silent for the majority of the questions. Regardless, we learn from the interrogator that Simon is the head of the cult, a veteran, and has connections with Nutri Co. And the only response that they managed to get out of Simon was when they mentioned the railway tunnel from 1945. Remember the one with the meat snake that's huge? Apparently, they kept feeding the snake after the war, and the creature disappeared in 1947. The interrogator then also mentioned that they know there's something else kept in the tunnel, which made Simon perk up. Because of this, the interrogator then asks Simon what's his connection with the entities and mentions that Simon seems to be fond of the Carnis species. So Simon responds with the word fools and that they don't understand, so the interrogator says that he wants to understand and learn why Simon has such a devotion towards them and why he did what he did to himself. Simon says that he doesn't question their will and that everyone must follow their will. We also learn that Simon has visions, and he says that he strays away from darkness and wants to meet the light for wonder and wisdom. This is when he starts to freak out and security had to be pulled in. And in the end, we see Simon's gruesome face. All I have to say is that me and other people assume that whatever Simon did to himself, he did to attempt to look like a mimic, so he brutalized his own face, or maybe he took a mimic's face to replace his own face, something along that. That's my assumption. It's pretty gross stuff. Also, it's clear that he's not a sane person. It makes me almost assume that he's brainwashed and the Singularity might be influencing his strange behavior, but again, that's just my initial assumption. Also, circling back to when they mentioned the big meat snake that was in the tunnel that disappeared one day, I'm assuming the snake just performed mitosis and split up into multiple meat snakes so it can leave the tunnel and disappear to who knows where. That makes sense since we see that happening during the experiment on the other video. Speaking of which, returning back to the previous video, the thing that happened with the Singularity at the end. The person wasn't dead. Their leg was just badly injured and broken. Could their screams of agony and their blood escaping their body be what triggered the Singularity? Not only that, but was something happening to the person because the medical team were obviously freaking out, so did the Singularity do something to the person? It didn't happen on screen, so I'm not sure what exactly happened to the person, but maybe, here's my assumption, the Singularity doesn't have to infect just dead people. If they get exposed to the innards of the person, that's when it can do a little bit of an influence? Maybe? Maybe the Singularity made the crawl sprout out of the person's body. Who knows? That's just, again, my assumption. In order to find out, let's now move on to the next video. Vita Carnis, First Contact. This is the latest video in the series, and it begins strangely with muffled red and dark visuals and an intense background noise before showing a triangle, then the Singularity freaking out again, just like in the previous video. And it turns out it wasn't the only one freaking out. All the entities are freaking out too. So much so that the staff started to panic a bit and they had to turn off the power. This is when everything went on a standstill and was dark until static takes over the screen and we're channel surfing just like in the previous videos, just with a few glitches here and there. However, that doesn't last long, and we return back to the people in the facility, and everything is seemingly stabilized. Regardless of stability, they still had to check the damages, and a team was sent in. And while in the chamber, the team tried to report that the Singularity was much more active, but unexpectedly, the radios weren't working. It almost sounded like the audio was muffled, however, there was more than that. I think the Singularity is interfering with the radios and making strange noises peek through. I think there were some words in there, but it was a little hard for me to understand. Regardless, the team had to run and the footage cuts away to more channel surfing and glitches. By the way, the glitches that we see are glimpses from past videos that explain the Vita Carnis species, and interestingly enough, after the glitches, we see more Magister's wonders, and they are explaining how radios work. But again, that doesn't last long, and we're now moving on to a summary report of an incident. Specifically, the one involving the cleaner who got injured, the one with the broken leg. It turns out they were caught between the steps of a ladder and snapped their femur. Ouch. We also learned that there was unusual bruising and clotting, but overall they're stable. Another piece of information we get told is that for some reason this irritated and caused extreme activity from the entities, which are the Singularities, but luckily no personnel were injured following the initial incident. We also get confirmation that during the inspection of the chambers, the guards' handheld transceivers were indeed interfered with, but to be more specific, the sounds were chaotic and random, but there were lines of speech from Dr. Trados, and who they assumed to be the entity too. Speaking of which, Dr. Trados did an experiment in which he had a device connected to the test chambers to communicate with the entity, and that's the audio that we'll be hearing now. Dr. Trados first asked if he could be heard and understood, in which he got a response saying yes. The doctor then tried to ask who or what they are, but didn't get a response, so they switched the device for one that was used for trimming testing, which was the alarm clock radio. The doctor then asked the question again, and the response was, "We to you." The doctor then asked for them to further explain, and they continued with, "We feel, suffer, thrive, purpose. We are..." There's a pause there, and the footage cuts for a second, but we return when the doctor asks, "What are your connections with the Vita Carnis species?" The response was, "Made to life, made to pain, figures, dancing, sleep, feel, feed, grow." This response was a little vague, so they then asked, "Do you know why you were here?" But that didn't get a response. Then at some point, the Singularity said, "Curious," which interested the doctor, and the Singularity continued by sharing their interest over the talking box device, which they soon learn is called a radio. The doctor then explains how radios works, which the Singularity said, "Brilliance, much brilliance." The Singularity also says they feel more noise, and that they want to see more. But they don't mean radios? It's a little confusing there. We then cut away to a bunch of visuals of nature, very short clips from previous videos, and the Magister's wonders before landing on footage of darkness and muffled noises as if we're underwater. That is until we actually start to hear clear audio of a conversation with a person and a doctor. The person talking to the doctor is hesitant about freely giving the entities what they want, since their motives are still unknown, to which the doctor argues that this is their biggest breakthrough. Not only that, but representatives of UN will be arriving soon, so they need more progress to report. So they can't stop because they need the funding. I'm assuming this whole conversation was eavesdropped by the Singularities. Speaking of which, the Singularities, as we can probably guess, were given radios with a speaker to allow more communication. Personnel even witnessed the Singularities communicating with each other. However, the communication had to be deciphered in order to understand what they were saying. We actually hear them talking, and yeah, creepy, and I don't understand. But at least we get told more information about the Singularities. By the way, each of the Singularities are called V and a number which goes up to 7 since there's 7 of them. And it turns out each Singularity acts differently from each other and can also have differing answers to certain questions. However, they all share a fascination with electronic devices like radios, and they are interested in entertainment like televisions and music. V1 especially likes TVs, or at least tampering with them, which we get shown, and it makes me wonder, the reason why this video is a jumbled mess of glitches and various clips, could it be because V1 is messing with the broadcast or the recordings? Speaking of which, we see a jumbled collection of clips before returning back to the reports. It's the last day before the representatives of UN arrive, and they manage to learn a lot about each of the Singularities' personalities. V1 has an interest in electronics and testing, however it's neutral and minimal with engagement and expressions. V2 has an eagerness for testing and is a curious type and deceptive with its wording. V3 has minimal engagements with personnel and is usually detached when engaged with, but is more active. V4 has a curiosity about testing and is actively engaging with personnel, but prefers to be the one asking questions rather than answering. V5 has seemingly no interest in communicating with personnel, however it speaks often and usually out loud to itself. V6 has minimal engagement with testing and usually doesn't acknowledge personnel and rarely speaks out loud, mainly incoherent noises. And lastly, V7. It has no interest engaging with activities that don't involve electronics, and it's the least active. Not only that, but it only engages with the other singularities. With all this data collected, they're ready for the representatives to arrive, which they do, and we hear the audio of the doctor giving a pitch to them, but suddenly alarms start to go off, and the singularity starts using the speakers to communicate. The singularity agrees with the doctor that they learn a lot during this stay, and if they were to continue this union, it would benefit everyone. It also says symbiosis will join them together, and that they want to guide the way to divine purpose. The singularity then repeats, "Join us," and to become one, as the footage starts to corrupt before it ends with darkness and breathing. This is the conclusion of the video, but just like before, there's an unlisted video that we can discover in the description. The unlisted video has crazy visuals of a skeleton-like figure, but the most noteworthy thing were texts that briefly flashed on screen. First, this one, August 30, 1992. Notable events: increase of Vita Carnis population around the facility, minor earthquakes near Facility 0, more interference with electronics than usual when testing with singularities, continue maintenance, and keep watch for more events. Then there's this one, April 3rd, 1995. Things are getting bad. More new hires are coming in to replace missing personnel. I worry when I will be next. Was right. We should have never continued our work here. They are neglecting every basic precaution now. They are building something. I will send you what I can. There's also something going on with the audio, and turning to the comments, the audio reverse says something along the lines, "We thought we were bright. We thought we were smart. We tried to reach the sky. Now we fall. Now you let me... we die. We dug too deep. We dug too far. Our ego is the end of ours, us? Now let me hang. Let me down. No time, mind? Now we..." And that's probably it. Interesting. With that being said, let's now move on to the conclusion to further discuss everything we learned. Conclusion. Crawl, trimmings, meat snakes, mimics, harvesters, hosts, and monoliths. 7 types of species in the Vita Carnis family and 7 singularities. Could this be a coincidence? Doubt it. And someone in the comments pointed out something interesting about the 7 singularities and how their differing personalities seem to connect to each of the species. V1 has dominance over conversations and is fascinated with electronics the same way as the Crawl dominates the world and is also just as drawn to electronics. Remember in the first season where they were drawn to this radio tower? Similar interest. Now V2 is seemingly friendly and active just like the cute trimmings, but is seemingly weaker compared to the other singularities the same way the trimmings are at the bottom of the food chain. V3 has no interest in communicating with personnel the same way meat snakes have no interest in interacting with humans because, you know, meat snakes, they only go after dead things. V4 has a strange interest in wanting to study humans the same way mimics observe and study humans before they hunt them. V5 is distant and keeps to itself, similar to harvesters who don't exactly infest the whole world and contains itself in its own space, doing whatever it pleases. V6, who could care less about testing and interactions the same way the hosts don't care about humans, and its incoherent noises could be connected to the host's random release of spores? And lastly, V7 only interacts with its own just like monoliths, which are seemingly unresponsive towards everything just like a still tree. However, that doesn't mean it can't be triggered. For the last 3, I feel like I could have explained it better, but let's just leave it at that. Now, clearly there's a connection between the singularities and the Vita Carnis species, and this feels like confirmation if it's true. All 7 types of the species inherited something from their singularities, which is why they share similar characteristics. And at the end of the last video in which we hear the singularities want to become one and have people in the facility join them, it kind of ties back to the trimmings hive mind situation. The trimmings have this connection, and I'm assuming the singularities want to spread this mentality. Maybe this could be why they're so fascinated with the radios in the first place. It's a form of communication when people are apart, and if the singularities have this goal to form a strange union with each other and other living creatures, of course this connection interests them. But that's just an assumption. Now the hidden videos with interesting texts. It seems like someone who's working the facility is stressed out and is seemingly willing to give up information to a mysterious group or person. Actually, I'm not sure if it's information, but they're sending something over to someone else, and this B person just wants out. Which is understandable since caution was thrown out the window the second they allowed the singularities to have access to radios and TVs. Speaking of which, a part of me once assumed that the singularities had a desire to choose what should be a part of the circle of life, and might be actively eliminating humans because they don't care about humanity, but since we hear them asking the humans in the facility to join them, and to become one with them, maybe the singularity wants to corrupt humanity and turn them into what they believe is their perfect vision? Or because they mentioned symbiosis, the singularities might have taken an interest in humans because of their advancements with technology like the radios, So they're offering this partnership to live together, to support each other and stuff. Again, this is just another assumption. And since a cult was once involved, the Singularities are obviously not completely against the idea of working with humans, and the cult did offer them sacrifices, so maybe that's just what they want. They want more sacrifices. Crazy and fascinating stuff. Oh, and I'm still in love with trimmings. They're so cute! Anyways, that's the end of today's video. The links to everything are in the description, and as always, my name is Estrella. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do that funny little notification thing, maybe leave a comment, here's my social medias, and I better not catch you dying on me. Goodbye!